and spiritual reality belonged to different realms of reality that didn't interact. From that time forward, it served a noble purpose at that time of getting the Inquisition off the backs of the intellectuals of that period of time. But it also, we proceeded down that path for 400 years, where consciousness, mind, and such things were not appropriate subjects for science, until along came quantum mechanics in the early 20th century. It's changed all that, and we now know, after, even though for most of the 20th century, the physicists have avoided, thanks to the Cartesian duality, have avoided the subject of consciousness, but now it's pretty obvious. And my team and a few others have worked on this in the latter part of the 20th century, and are very convinced that most of the so-called paranormal phenomena, which cannot be explained in classical science, classical physics, can mostly be explained within quantum science. And that's what noetics is all about. That's what my work is mostly all about, is to apply that new understanding of the late 20th century in the quantum world that's helping revise biology, cosmology, and physics to account for many things that we call mysterious, mystical, spiritual ideas from the very deep past. And we still have a long ways to go. We think we're a pretty smart species at this point in time, but frankly, we're just barely out of the trees. As I said, the Industrial Revolution didn't really get going in full measure until the middle of the 19th century. And here we are just 150 years later. That seems, for children, I guess, growing up and starting to study history, that sounds like a long time. But many of us in this room are close to 80 or so, and that's pretty much a century, you know? And so 150 years doesn't seem like a lot of time to some of us. Okay, are we back so we can talk?
Yes, we
Dr. Mitchell, my name is Bill, and I have two questions. I hope I'm not aggravating with them.
Go ahead.
There's a download of NASA videos that was never intended for public consumption, and it was by a TV manifestation up in Canada, Stubbs. He had hundreds of hours of NASA download. I thought the one I find most interesting was the mission STS-75, where there was a tether antenna that go 12 miles long. And you see these things that are not every disk, that are flying behind the antenna, that are about 3 miles in diameter, that are pulsating. And it's in the invisible range because he said the NASA camera was in the ultraviolet range. But there seem to be life forms that are beyond our visibility, or either that or the physics, but it could be a crab, in a high energy state. Mass in a high energy state.
Well, let me interrupt you at this point. Most of what you're talking about, that's not in my area that I really consider myself expert. However, I tend to think at this point in time, these so-called hidden areas, there's not much doubt that cloaking devices, we are starting to get a little bit of a handle on cloaking devices, but not, it's apparent that our alien visitors have much more knowledge in that than we do. I personally, at the moment, do not think, when we start thinking about other dimensions, I think the evidence for that is pretty slim. And maybe turn out that that's what it is. But at the moment, I can't speak to that with what you're asking with authority.
Okay, I have one more question.
Go ahead.
In science, we see energy, we know how to manipulate it, all the different conversions, mechanical to heat, stuff like that. Yet, what is the essence of energy?
What is the essence of energy? Is that your question?
That's the question. What is the essence of it?
Well, I don't think we know the answer to that any more than the fact that energy seems to be the fundamental stuff. Now, my model of it is that I call it, instead of dualism, which is a Cartesian notion, and dualism in quantum physics, wave-particle duality, and the Cartesian duality, I think of terms in terms of dyads, or two faces of the same thing. So I express it this way. Energy is the fundamental stuff. And the way we think of energy as its waveforms, Now, that's simplistic modeling, but that's the way we do it. But I think in terms of dyads, that is, energy is the basis of matter, a la Einstein. Energy equal mc squared. That is the energy of matter. But if we take the universe that we live in and know about, knowing is pretty fundamental too. And knowing based on information. And information is just basically patterns of energy. So we here have two faces of energy. One is matter. Our existence is dependent upon matter. Our knowing is dependent upon information. And we live in a universe that exists and knows. And that's a pretty fundamental definition. And that's the place I start. Now, there may be more complex and more other ways to look at it that can solve more problems. But at the moment, this dyadic model of existing and knowing based upon matter and the breaking down of matter into its energy component, which is what science does, and information as patterns of energy is a good way to look at it when we're solving a lot of problems, particularly if we can now use the tools of quantum mechanics and relativity. But as many of you are aware, that putting quantum mechanics and relativity together has proven to be a very formidable task, and we haven't been successful with that yet.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored that you're here today. I just wanted to share with you.
Well, let's push it, Mike.
Oh, okay. I'm kind of intimidated. I said I'm quite honored to meet you today and to ask you some questions of us. I'm from Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm Marie Rink, and my son is a webmaster. We have Lufon in all over. Anyhow, and what I wanted to ask you
Let's push it to
what I wanted to ask you is about the moon, of course. And there's always the rumors that they say there's the dark side of the moon and that there is some kind of entities that are around that area that we don't see. And of course, they say it's a satellite. So I have to ask you that. And then of course about Mars and the atmosphere is not.
Okay. Well, first of all, let's not consider the dark side of the moon, because there isn't a dark side of the moon. There's the back side, which we don't see. But we have seen it. Those of us who have flown there have seen it. We've taken pictures of it. And it is markedly different than the front side. But that's largely because in ancient times, and the Earth, the moon, that's, hey, that's a good idea. Somebody stand in front of that light. Thank you. In ancient times, when the Earth-Moon system was brand new, but the moon had been captured, and it was stabilized in its orbit. The lava inside the moon came out as lava flows like it does on Earth, but it came out on the front side because of gravitational pull and filled all the craters on the front side. Now the ancients, time of Galileo and so forth, considered